Hello, my name is Travis Bembenek. I'm the owner and CEO of Mexico News Daily. I am joined with my friend George Revis, and today we are going to attempt to not be confidently wrong as we talk about an important issue in Mexico. George?
Yeah, so today we're going to talk about AMLO's legacy, and we're not going to go super in detail about, everything that he did, but more just a broad overview of several of just the topics like foreign relations, the economy, infrastructure, crime, poverty, healthcare. And we wanted to sort of dive into this stuff because with AMLO, it seems very polarizing, right, Travis? If you're pro-Morena, you love AMLO and everything he's done. And if you're not Morena, you hate AMLO and everything he's done. So that's why I want to just sort of take an objective look at what he did do and discuss it with you to break it down to remove those subjective stereotypes that everybody believes.
Yeah, I think, as you said, he's a very polarizing figure. I've talked to thousands of Mexicans over the years of his term and then afterwards, and it is amazing the emotion he brings out, right? Nobody is sort of middle of the road on him. They have strong emotions. And so I think on that note, we're both American. I think it's important to point out that obviously everyone's personal thoughts on a politician is a combination of heart and mind, right? And I don't want to minimize in any way, sort of what someone who is Mexican, born and raised, living here their whole life may have in their heart. And George and I really are going to be a little bit more analyzing things from the mind perspective, right? So there's a lot of personal emotion that goes into choices of politicians. We're going to be talking more just about the data and what the numbers say and as a way to really evaluate his term.
Yeah, that's a great point. As two Americans, a lot of people might be annoyed just by the fact that we're talking about their president, right? So I think that's a great point, Travis.
Well, just again, on that note, a little bit of my motivation on wanting to talk about this as well is so many American friends of mine have asked me. They've said, look, it seems like he's popular, but every Mexican I talk to hates him. And so What's the deal, right? And so that's what we're going to be trying to talk about today. What's the deal on that contradiction?
No, that's a great point. Well, let's dive into, and me and you, Travis, were talking about this earlier, let's just start with sort of foreign relations. And I think we're in agreement on this, and just give me your thoughts on his sort of, foreign relations policy and how he handled that during his presidency.
Yeah, sure. I think that's a good place to start to really understand AMLO because, he was the head of Mexico City before he became president. He tried unsuccessfully to be president several times before. And so, he came into this with some very strong policy positions domestically. And so ultimately when he became president, he made it very clear that his focus was going to be on domestic issues. He took pride in actually not really ever traveling outside the country. He just left a few times in his 6-year term. He actually sold the presidential Air Force One because he said he didn't need it and there was better use of money for the Mexican government. And so again, he made it very clear, and he actually had this sort of famous saying where he said, the best foreign policy for Mexico is really to get the domestic policy right. So, in my work here at Mexico News Daily, I've had the opportunity to talk to a lot of ambassadors, right? Foreign ambassadors based in Mexico. And they found it frustrating just because they really couldn't get on AMLO's radar given his domestic focus.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And I think it was a sort of a good time for the Mexican president to focus inwardly, right? And is that even a word? I think so.
I think it is. Sure.
And I think a lot of the Mexican people appreciated that he did that he focused on those domestic issues, and I think that not won him popularity, but I think that was appreciated. The other thing is he's sort of known as just being pragmatic when it came to his foreign relations. He was just, he didn't really seem to overreact too much. He didn't travel that much. He just focused, on Mexico. So some people would say that maybe that was a lack of foreign relations. I don't know if I necessarily agree with that, but overall, it is what it is, and the Mexican people, in general, on a whole, I think we're pretty happy with the way he handled that.
Yeah, and I think it's important to note that Trump's first term corresponded with, in part, some of AMLO's term, and surprisingly, given where AMLO is on the political spectrum, he had a pretty good relationship with President Trump, and President Trump acknowledged that. So, again, wasn't a priority, but I think when and where and how he had to engage in foreign policy, he did so. Again, I think the business community and many of sort of the consulate community definitely did not feel like he did what he could have and should have done with engaging other countries with Mexico.
No, that's a good point. All right, let's move on from that, and let's talk about one of your favorite topics, Travis, infrastructure. Because I think we have slightly differing, views on some of these things. Three of his big projects, or two of his big projects, were the Mayan Train project. Another one was the refinery in Tabasco, the oil refinery in Tabasco, and then obviously, which we've already talked about, him sort of canceling the airport. That wasn't his project, but that was a canceled major infrastructure project. So let's talk about.
I would add one more to that, George. Not to interrupt, but I'd add one more, and that's the Mexico's version of the Panama Canal, right? So the train of the it's not the best name in the world, but the train of the Isthmus of Tehuantepec, which is basically, the isthmus where Mexico is most narrow between Pacific Ocean and the Caribbean. Another project there was creating a train project to haul freight.
Right, but he didn't do that.
Well, it's been completed now. Yeah, that was one of the main infrastructure projects under him as well.
So it is completed now? I didn't even know that.
It is completed. As some of these other projects, there's infrastructure still filling in around it.
Right.
But that train has been finished and it is operational.
Okay, cool. Well, let's talk about the Maya Train project, because this is a very divisive project, right? People either love it or hate it. It's usually the people who love AMLO love the train project. The people that don't like him don't like it. But it began construction in 2020. Some sections got inaugurated in 23. It's still sort of under phased rollout now. It's getting closer to completion. The projected costs originally were about $7 to $8 billion. The project costs doubled and are now estimated to be roughly between 15 and 20 billion, which I find not humorous at all, because it's whatever, it's Mexico's money, and I hate seeing when projects double in cost. But that was one of his biggest complaints about the airport too, was just the astronomical costs, how under budgeted it was, or how off the original projections of the costs were going to be. And yet here's one of his signature projects, and the same exact thing happened under his watch with budget of 7 to 8 billion, and it ended up being 15 to 20 billion.
Yeah, George, I would stop you there a minute. I don't think AMLO, first of all, the budget, the overrun on the budget, of course, is unfortunate, and
that always happens.
Gives fuel to the opposition as to the cynicism, as you pointed out. What I would highlight, though, is I think AMLO had a very different vision with these infrastructure projects. And it was kind of in three buckets. The first one is that the south of the country had huge neglect in terms of infrastructure spending, right? When I say south, I mean Oaxaca,
Where coincidentally
Chiapas.
he's also from.
Yes, and he's from there, exactly. So again, you could be cynical and say, well, that's coincidence, or you could say he really understands that area. So again, I think the Maya train, the train of the Isthmus of Tehuantepec, and the refinery all fall in that category of wanting to move infrastructure investment to an area that had been neglected. The refinery falls into this second bucket as well of Mexico's sovereignty, right? So kind of sadly and ironically, Mexico does have a lot of oil, and they pull it out of the ground or out of the Gulf of Mexico, and then they need to send it to the United States to get refined. And so AMLO, really took that project on, saying, we need sovereignty, we need to be able to refine our own oil. And so, that was sort of the logic behind that project. And then the third one you mentioned, that I would say the third bucket is, Mexico City did need an airport alternative or additional airport. And so that's why he prioritized that one.
All right, so back to the refinery again. Basically, same exact numbers. Budgets estimated 8 billion, ended up being 16 to 20 billion. The projected output as of 2024 was about half capacity. They were originally trying to do, I think, 340,000 barrels per day, and currently it's only doing about 170,000 barrels per day. So do you think this is sort of one of those, in both examples, biting off more than you can chew and not following through on the projects?
I think, that refinery in particular, there's no doubt it's taken far longer than expected. The ramp up has taken far longer and had issues. The cost overrun is tremendous. But I think on massive projects like that, wherever you are in the world, that's not particularly uncommon, right? I think the bigger question is just, did it make sense for Mexico, who has, which a country that has so many more basic needs in healthcare and education, did it make sense to spend more than $10 billion on an oil refinery when you have, massive refining capacity just across the border in Texas? I think that's the bigger question. I think the refinery will get up and running to capacity. It's just taking time. We don't know the answer of that yet.
Also, when the rest of the world is trying to move their focus off of fossil fuels to then make that type of an investment into fossil fuels versus other alternative, energy sources, right?
Yeah, especially, Mexico has declining oil production, right? So it did seem like an odd, again, there's some strong arguments on sovereignty and how can it be that we have, not our own oil refining capacity. But you bring up good points that just in a time of declining oil production, in a time of countries and companies looking for green energy sources, and again, when Mexico has so many other needs, it felt like a massive spend in what many would see as not a priority area. It wasn't really solving a problem. Again, in AMLO's mind, it was a oil sovereignty problem, but in most people's minds, it wasn't really solving a problem. Just to go back to your Maya train, I think that, we'll see. Projects like that have 50, 75-year life cycles, right? So, we're in the first couple of years, and I don't think we can weigh in yet on whether or not, it's going to be successful. I think we can definitely weigh in on the facts, which are that, there's huge cost overruns, there were environmental concerns, but the fact that investment infrastructure was pushed to relatively neglected areas, we can't deny. And I think history will tell us how successful of a project it is.
You bring up a good point, and I was going to talk about this later, but I think we'll talk about it now. That when analyzing AMLO's legacy, a lot of this stuff we're just going to have to see how it pans out, right? The airport,
That's right.
we're going to have to see how that pans out. The refinery, we're going to see how that pans out. Even the Maya train, we're going to have to see how that pans out, meaning it might be a little early to pass judgment on a lot of these things because time will tell, and it still is a little early. But on your comment about how a lot of people thought that they should be spending what ended up being about $20 billion on other sort of social infrastructure projects, whether that be healthcare or reducing the poverty level, which we're going to talk
Education.
about, education, which I think you did a great job. But coincidentally, they started the Maya Train project in 2000, or excuse me, it was inaugurated in 2022, and it was, hold on, I'm looking at my wrong notes. Hold on one sec.
No
it
problem.
was inaugurated in December of 23, and it started construction in 2020. As that sort of relates to healthcare, in 2020, there were 35.7 million people who did not have access to public health care. In 2022, right when all that money is being funneled into either the refinery, the Mayan train, whatever, there was 50.4 million people that did not have access to public health care. So that number ranges from an increase of people without access to public health care between 15 and 20 million people, between 2020 and 2022, at the exact same time that all of these billions of dollars are being funneled into these other infrastructure projects like the train and the refinery. So what do you say about that?
Well, I mean, I think the way you just presented the data, and I'm not criticizing, just the way you laid it out would sort of suggest that AMLO wasn't focused on social programs or wasn't focused on the poor. And I think that would be the wrong interpretation.
I think he was. I'm specifically talking about healthcare because there were some serious problems in the health system when AMLO was president, per the numbers and per his legacy. So, we'll talk about poverty reduction, which I think he did an amazing job. We'll talk about that in a second.
Yes.
But I'm specifically relating this to healthcare, which is a major issue for the citizens of Mexico.
I've talked to a lot of people and I've read a lot, and I don't, I would say, and I'm generalizing to some extent, I don't think significant improvements were made in the healthcare space under AMLO. Of course, Morena fanatics would violently disagree with me. Those that don't like Morena would agree with me. But I think at the end of the day, looking at sort of some of the numbers you point out and just sort of the facts around things, he did take some big swings on getting pharmaceutical products closer to people with sort of distribution centers and
But there were a lot of distribution. There were a lot of distribution problems with prescriptions and medication. There were millions of people who couldn't, get access to cancer drugs, specifically like kids' cancer drugs became very difficult to find, and a lot of people went without prescriptions.
That's why I'm agreeing with you, George. I don't think part of his legacy will be a marked improvement in the healthcare space.
Well, and in his defense too, I also want to point out this all happened during COVID, right? And I think COVID rattled health systems, national health systems all over the world. It's not just Mexico, and to talk about healthcare and public health and not mention that we went through COVID during his presidency, I think is unfair to AMLO.
That's fair. And a lot of people, as did in many countries, criticized their leaders' handling of the COVID pandemic. And I think Mexico was no exception. Over 100,000 people died. AMLO took a little bit more, less lockdown type approach than other countries. His argument was it kept people working, it kept people, being able to support their families and put food on the table. But at the same time, there's no doubt there were
Well, which is kind of ironic a little bit in the sense that, Sheinbaum, his predecessor now, I was in Mexico City during COVID for a lot of it, and Sheinbaum, really locked it down. I remember being
I
in
think
Mexico.
there you've got a density difference, right?
Of
when
course,
you're looking at the
of
whole
course.
country versus
Of course. No, of course.
Mexico City.
One other thing I want to bring up, and this isn't necessarily an AMLO issue because I think these numbers were the same before with Peña Nieto, with even dating back to Fox and Calderon. But for the OSED countries, the Mexico spends the least amount per their GDP of any of the OSED countries. Between 2.5 and 2.7% of their GDP gets spent on public health care, with the average of OSED countries being about 6 to 7%. And AMLO, during his sort of last hurrah speech, he was comparing Mexico's health system to Denmark's and saying not only is Mexico's as good, he went on to say, no, it's not as good, it's better than Denmark's.
Most Mexicans found that absurd, right? So I wouldn't even pay attention to that. It's absurd.
Right.
Mexico, as you point out, spends far too low of a percentage of GDP on healthcare and education, for that matter. So the bigger question you're bringing up is really the prioritization that AMLO had. Refineries, airports, trains, and not as much as you'd think. Healthcare and education. Now, again, that sounds like it would be someone who doesn't care so much about the poor or improving the.
Well, he obviously does, and we're going to get to that on the next one let's just talk about it, poverty, and what he has done to reduce poverty levels in Mexico, and he made dramatic strides, combating poverty. I don't know if you want to hear some of the numbers, but he did a phenomenal job. I think the numbers,
the numbers at a higher level are that of all the sort of leading economies of the world, over the last 5-6 years, Mexico has had the largest reduction of poverty of any of those countries. Now, that's the good news. If you look at it a little bit more in detail, you could say, well, look, there's two ways you could go about reducing poverty. One is creating growth, right? Creating an environment where companies are investing, growing, hiring, giving raises, or you could do it through, government mandated, minimum wage increases and social programs, right?
Which he did.
Ultimately, he did it that way. So the good news, and it can't be taken away from him, is that poverty reduced quite dramatically in Mexico. There's a long ways to go, but it's on the right path now, after a long time of not being on the right path and pretty stagnant. But the bigger question is, how did he get it done, right? And as I mentioned, minimum wage was increased 100% in AMLO's 6 years. Now, over 100%. It was doubled. And you could say, well, man, how is that going to make Mexico competitive? I think, it is important to point out that, again, if you're looking at the leading industrialized countries, Mexico had one of the very lowest minimum wages. So it was one of those cases where the minimum wage really had not kept up with inflation for many, many years. And, and there's this argument I've heard from people, you hear it in the U.S., well, nobody really makes minimum wage, it's not really relevant. That's not true in Mexico. I've read studies, from reputable, bipartisan committees that have said something like 40% of the population makes minimum wage. So when the minimum wage is doubled in a 6-year period, it's significant.
Massive impact.
Exactly.
Okay, I don't want to come across as anti-AMLO, and I'm not trying to point out all his faults, and that's why I wanted to make a big deal out of the poverty too, because I do think he did a great job about that. I just think, that's what we're here for, to sort of talk about these things and analyze the legacy, right? So let's talk about sort of crime, organized crime, and how do you think sort of AMLO fared with that?
Yeah, again, and so, you got to look at the data you have here, right? And also take things with a grain of salt. And
I have some data.
Yeah, again, without wanting to get too wonky, I'll give you sort of what many people say, trying to triangulate the data given by the government under AMLO. I would say the big picture, and I think that's what matters here, is I don't think there was a market improvement in crime or crackdown on the cartels in the AMLO years, period. Now, of course, Morena would disagree with me, but if you look at the data, and the data can get wonky, and let me give you an example how. You could point to deaths going down or homicides going down.
That's one of the data points I want to bring up.
Okay,
and
then go ahead.
There were, under AMLO, there was a record of over 156,000 homicides during his presidency, which is the highest number under any Mexican president in modern history. However, if you look at that per capita and not just at an overall number, it is actually, a little bit lower than some of his predecessors, about the same. Yeah. Meaning, if you focus on that 156,000, homicides number being, the statistic, that's not sort of presented right, and you're going to get a skewed opinion of it, because I don't think it necessarily got better by any means. I don't.
No,
but
it didn't.
But I don't think it got all that much worse either.
Right, and so that's why, again, I think for our listeners' perspective, that's the big question, right? Did it get better or not? And I think the big picture on that question is it didn't, right? So homicides and gross went up, but then you add in missing persons that went up, and all of a sudden the homicides don't. It could be a classification issue. When you look at per capita as you did, there's a lot of noise there. But I think the big picture is AMLO came in with a strategy on crime and cartels of hugs, not bullets. So he wanted to bring down the levels of crime and homicides from cartels by a non-violent strategy. And it didn't work, right? The hugs, not bullets, didn't work.
Did not work.
And so I think that's the point. Now, previous administrations had maybe tried more of a bullets, not hugs, and that didn't work either. So to your point, I don't think it got significantly worse. I don't think it got significantly better. So I think it was an looking at it from Mexico's perspective, you lost 6 years where levels of crime, corruption, and cartel activity remained far too high. Right, and as a result, too many people lost their lives or family members or just lived in fear. That's the bigger picture. There wasn't a market improvement in that over his term.
No, I agree, and I think it's unfortunate. Last thing that I just want to touch on is the judicial reform, which he did basically on his way out of office, right? And the judicial reform was mainly about electing, through general elections, electing all federal judges in Mexico. And I want to point out that no other country in the world, except for Bolivia, elects all of their federal judges. And even Bolivia doesn't elect as many federal judges as Mexico. In Mexico, all federal judges are now elected. And, I think that time is going to tell on this policy too, right? And it hasn't necessarily had a negative effect yet, except for the loss of the super peso, which I want to talk about. But, if there is no other country in the world that is electing all of their federal judges, do you think this has a chance of panning out to the benefit of Mexico?
Well, this is another one. The phasing out, it's over actually like 3 years, I believe, that the country's kind of divided up. And so already the first years of elections of judges happen, and it'll happen more the next year. But it's very early in this process, right? To simplify it the most possible, there's two ways to get judges: appointing or electing. In the United States, we do both. It's important to point that out. We do both in the United States.
Not nearly on the level of what Mexico's proposing, nor is any country in the world.
I think there's arguments. So again, in the United States, we do both. In different countries, they're appointed or both. And I think it's important to point out in Mexico that nobody felt like the judiciary system was a stellar example of practicing and applying the law, right? So it is very early in the process. There's strong arguments that would say, look, how do you expect an average voter to really understand which judge candidate has what sort of positions? There's really strong arguments around that. I remember, when I vote in the U.S. and I see the county clerk and some of those positions, you're just not very informed on some of those because the information isn't there. And so that's the biggest argument, I think.
Well, you also want to elect or you also want somebody who's a judge who is going to uphold the law as it's written, right? I mean, that's the whole point.
Yeah, but there's no evidence yet to suggest that.
You don't want somebody winning a popularity contest through, a public vote to become a judge.
Right, but that would imply that the appointing system is not flawed either.
Oh, it's flawed,
and that's
for sure.
Flawed. And so it's early. It was a lot of people were hoping sort of AMLO had teed it up, and they were hoping that Sheinbaum would sort of call a timeout on it and maybe have some more studies, on the impact and things like that. And so without a doubt, he put the wheels in motion, and then Sheinbaum continued with it. We don't know the impact yet. The business community was very concerned. The United States and other countries weighed in against it. But if you look at the short term here, foreign direct investments hitting record highs. The U.S. Continues to import more from Mexico than any other country. So it's hard to know at this point still if it's just noise and a speed bump or if it's something much bigger than that.
Well, you said a lot of the business community was worried about that judicial referendum, which, on the economy, one of AMLO's biggest legacies was the super peso, right? And everybody lauded him for that. And, I don't really know how, but, the peso was super strong and he was credited with that and the super peso. However, once he basically came out and said, we are going to even attempt these judicial reforms, the peso went from basically 17 in June of 2024 up to 20.1 by the time the House approved the judicial reform in September, which was an 18% weakening of the peso in 4 months. So It's sort of like he's known as part of his legacy, the super peso, and then he kind of blew up the super peso with the implementation of the judicial reforms by weakening the peso 18% and sort of threw that.
I think that's a bit of an oversimplification, and maybe this could be a podcast for a future episode. The movements of currencies is far more complicated than one issue.
1,000%.
So a lot goes into it. You picked one data point and one news headline and triangulated a devaluation, and it's far more complex than that, as I know you know.
I do know that. However, all indicators, there were a few, but the major indicator for the weakening of the peso was the judicial reform.
I guess I'd ask you this, George. Do you know where the peso ended AMLO's term versus where it started? Stronger or weaker?
Well, it ended up stronger, but the peso historically, or the dollar historically appreciates over the peso over time.
Right, but I think that's the point, George, right? And we maybe should have touched on this right off the start. At the beginning of AMLO's term, many people said the peso would crash, inflation would skyrocket,
Totally, good point.
Foreign direct investment would dry up. Those things didn't happen.
Nope.
So yeah, I mean, we can nitpoint and pick and say, well, but it was more a feature of a weak dollar than a strong peso. But at the end of the day, the arguments that were made, these big, strong arguments that Mexico's economy would crash under AMLO and his policies didn't happen.
Didn't happen.
And I think it's important just to touch on beyond the peso. There's a couple other economic indicators that I think are important because foreign direct investment, I mentioned. Foreign direct investment kept hitting record highs under AMLO. So you could say, well, that was a factor of nearshoring. That had nothing to do with AMLO. Okay, that's an argument. You could also say, well, but people expected it to completely collapse under AMLO and his policies. That didn't happen. The other thing the business community rightly points out is that although foreign direct investment kept hitting highs, the majority of it was reinvestment of profits. So it wasn't new. And a lot of people on the opposition side of the aisle to Moreno would say the actual foreign direct investment numbers should have been far higher if new investment was pouring in, which it didn't under AMLO. So it's complex. I think, again, the takeaway for our listeners is we got, there was some really dark rhetoric before AMLO was elected.
It was doomsday scenario
to the country.
Yeah.
It was, the next Venezuela, everybody's going to leave, capital's going to leave. That didn't happen. And so Mexico, I believe, it's sort of like the crime conversation. Mexico lost an opportunity to grow faster, to attract more foreign direct investment under AMLO than I think they could have under other leaders. But at the end of the day, things didn't get terrible. Things didn't collapse as many predicted.
Agreed. All right, so let's sum it up.
All right.
You first, and then I'm just going to blame it on time will tell.
All right, I'll just do two quick things that I guess I would say would be AMLO's legacy. The first one is the poverty reduction, right? At the end of the day, he's always been this candidate for the working class, the forgotten, either in economic terms or geographic terms in the country. And I think the fact that he put some significant investment in those areas, he implemented controversial social programs for those people. But at the end of the day, I think one of the two big parts of his legacy is going to be this significant poverty reduction that we're seeing continuing under his predecessor. I think the second thing of his legacy, and this one speaks for itself, is, he is largely credited with Claudia Sheinbaum winning her presidency.
100%. 100%.
So he helped her, become and selected her and helped her and trained her and coached her to become the mayor of Mexico City and then ultimately the president. And so however you feel about AMLO, I think the fact that he has selected someone who has an extraordinarily high approval rating right now, first woman leader in North America, is a big part of his legacy as well. What about you, George? What would you say?
A lot of people, if you like Sheinbaum or don't like her, they're going to say, well, that part of his legacy is terrible, right? If you like Sheinbaum, you're going to say that's great. If you like Morena, you're going to say he did an amazing job building the Morena party and making it a very strong party in Mexico. On the contrary, if you don't like Morena, that is terrible. I have not mixed opinions, but like I said, I think a lot of these infrastructure projects that he's done, I think time is going to tell. I think the judicial reform stuff, I think time is going to tell. I don't think that will necessarily go over well in time, but let's not judge it until it happens. Yes, the poverty, I think he should get, major, a credit for that. And it is a huge deal, especially in a country like Mexico, who does have millions of people living below the poverty level, and any, strides that can be made to reduce those levels of poverty, I think is fantastic. And I think he did a good job. So, we'll see what happens with the other stuff. And more importantly, though, back to sort of what you said is, it was doomsday scenario when he got elected, right? And this is going to be another Maduro, another Chavez, and it wasn't. It did not end up like that. And now Morena is stronger than ever with a sitting Morena president with an approval rating over 70%.
Well, and on that note, I think it's appropriate just to circle back where we began, where it's easy to be confidently wrong in the space of politics, right? Very easy, because you hear a soundbite, you hear a data point, you hear a friend say something, and it's easy to just take that as gospel. And as hopefully you've seen as we've talked through this, in order to be less confidently wrong, it really does require a lot of reading, a lot of talking to people, a lot of triangulating of information. And things usually aren't that black and white, because you can always argue, well, it needs more time. You got to look at it from a different perspective. So with that note, thank you for joining George and I, and let's all make an effort to be less confidently wrong going forward. Thank you.
Thanks, Travis.